for certain roles, certain subjects, but we're seeing a lot of flexibility now. A lot of companies that you might think of as white collar don't actually require necessarily you to have a university degree to apply in the first place.
Is a white-collar political revolution on its way? New research by pollsters Focaldata suggests areas of the UK with concentrations of high-income, white-collar jobs are the most exposed to job losses due to AI. And with AI job concerns and high levels of unhappiness with our politics, could those in so-called comfortable Britain be set to revolt against the government? Let's discuss this with James Kanagasooriam, Chief Research Officer at the polling company Focaldata and Times columnist. Welcome to you. Before we talk specifically about what you've been writing on AI, can I just get your thoughts on this migrant deal, which would equate to us sending 50 migrants back to France per week, but with an average of 840 or so arriving every week since Labour took power, it would equate to 1 in 17 if arrivals continue.
Thanks very much. So, look, I think the main thing to point out on migration is that the public opinion concern, which has clearly fueled both the rise of reform, but caused great problems both to this government and the last one, is that the public will need to see sustained progress made. So there might be a headline of 17 to 1, but I think people will react and wait to see, basically, after a year, does it look like the system is working? Is there a degree of control? Are the promises that have been made being kept? Because I think people are quite cynical. We've had various different mechanisms, different ministers, different propositions. I think it's a very sceptical, jaded public when it comes to migration. You know, people have lost the belief and faith that things can change all the way from David Cameron onwards. So I think it's too soon to tell. But the cynic in me thinks that the results are really what needed, as opposed to kind of slogans or promises or rolling out the red carpet.
Right. Well, James, I read your column and it was a real wake-up call, actually, in terms of the potential impact of jobs being taken by AI in certain parts of society. What are the constituencies most at risk?
So, what we found is that the top 5 constituencies that had the greatest number of jobs that had what we call high exposure to different elements of artificial intelligence, and there are lots of different technologies. This was a kind of a blended score taking into account a whole variety of technologies. But they were all London seats, so Richmond Park, Hampstead and Highgate, cities of London and Westminster, Battersea, Wimbledon, Chelsea and Fulham. There's a bit of a pattern there. For a start, they're all some of the highest income areas of Britain, with very expensive housing, proportionately much higher numbers of people in white-collar jobs, and high income ones where there is a degree of replacement that could occur. Very high Remain vote shares, high levels of education, lots of people who've gone to university. And for us, this is almost the opposite of what you would call the left behind, right? It's the opposite. Yeah. It's literally the inverse of the Brexit referendum. And from my perspective, it's been a long time since those areas haven't had things going their way. And for me, the big story about kind of doing this modelling and then looking at it both from a work occupation perspective, but also a geographic perspective, is it opens up a new front from in terms of political dislocation, because of course there are going to be upsides to AI and advances of that, particularly with people who can augment their skills. But what we're already seeing at the milk round is that a huge number of kind of white-collar workers are simply not getting the jobs that they expect to. Now, that's not going to affect executives who live in those seats today, but it creates a pipeline issue.
Yeah,
and when you roll that through, exactly.
I mean, it's interesting then, what's your take on universities and the value of them, and graduates coming out with significant amounts of debt and not necessarily being able to get the sorts of jobs in quite large numbers that they were expecting?
Look, I think it presents a lot of challenges to quite a wide variety of sectors, but it particularly is quite a pointed challenge to people, for example, that might have a degree that is, for example, not from what we call one of the top tier universities, where there's going to be a challenge and there's no differentiator in the job market. If there are fewer white collar jobs, we don't exactly have a system with 50% of people going to university that's aligned to that. So we could well see a lot of potential for restructure. That's already happening. There's a huge amount of funding pressure in higher education. That said, there are clearly still a need for people to have degrees for certain roles, certain subjects, but we're seeing a lot of flexibility now. A lot of companies that you might think of as white collar don't actually require necessarily you to have a university degree to apply in the first place.
Yes.
And for me, the really interesting thing that came out from the research is just the jobs where, your automation risk is just much lower. Whether that you're a plasterer or a plumber, it's quite obvious. It's jobs of where you basically use your hands or your body. But again, that for us, that's quite interesting. Right? That's not who you think of as necessarily people who are most secure in society.
No, well, as you say, there seems to be a sort of inversion of all the assumptions that we might have held, rightly or wrongly. What's the political impact? Because if you've got more discontent from a newish body of voters, what does Keir Starmer do about that?
Well, I think that there's a couple of things to note. First of all, what's the time risk to this? Like, at what stage does this really start to hit? And you're already starting to see it in kind of graduate recruitment immediately. So there's a clear kind of political risk there, because we're already talking about perhaps graduates who have come out, not seen the job opportunities that exist. They may, for example, port much more easily into a challenge on the left, whether that be the Green Party or, of course, the new mooted kind of Corbyn Party. It may bring together a lot of younger graduate voters who may be drifting already from the Labour Party and will want representation, will want someone to be their voice about a job market that continues to decline and hasn't really come back since the great financial crash.
Yes.
And is now going to contract even more.
Yes.
I think the other thing is that's slightly overlooked is that Reform seem to be doing better the less AI exposure there is by parliamentary constituency. And I'm very interested to see the politics of comfortable, secure blue-collar Britain, I think, is not talked about enough.
Well, James Kanagasooriam, pollster and Chief Research Officer of Focaldata, thank you very much. An awful lot of food for thought.